very much, Hayley, and thanks to everyone for attending today. Thanks very much to the Queensland Government for the invitation, and particularly you, Hayley, for the invitation to present today. I'm based in Launceston in Tasmania. It's actually a public holiday here today as well. This presentation is partly funded by Meat and Livestock Australia, but also many other organisations, which I show down there at the bottom of the screen. So really a segue from what Hayley just said. There is a lot of contention and hype about soil carbon markets at the moment. So I've called this presentation Soil Carbon Markets, Science or Snake Oil, and I'll elaborate on that throughout the presentation today. So I thought I'd start off with some indicative costs of what it actually takes to participate in soil carbon markets. So I spoke with 3 or 4 leading consultants in Australia to get these costs. The costs of sampling really ranges quite widely, and that's really determined by the amount of cores that you have to take, physical cores on farm, and the amount of cores that you have to take is really determined by landscape variability. So if you had a perfect landscape that was a homogeneous soil that was identical for 500 hectares or the whatever size you wanted to sample across, in theory, you'd only really need 1 sample because there'd be no variability between sites or between spots in the soil. So the variability of your soil really determines the number of samples that you actually need. So I mean, it varies depending on the soil type and the topography and all that sort of thing. So it can range from around $30 to $175 a core. You need a minimum of 9 samples, and that's a minimum for the 2021 Soil Carbon ERF or Emissions Reduction Fund methodology, or really a policy. That payment can be paid in ACCUs, which is an Australian carbon credit unit. 1 carbon credit is 1 tonne of CO2 equivalents, and that's in that way it's a type of loan, and that can range from between 15 to 30% of ACCUs earned. That's if you earn any ACCUs, and an ACCU is earned by accumulating soil carbon. So the costs of sampling soil carbon in my quick research of the topic is around between $15 to $60 a hectare. The Australian government has what's called the Soil Carbon Innovation Challenge, where they've invested a lot of money into research and development to reduce the cost of measuring soil carbon, and their target is $3 a hectare, and that might come through satellite imagery or modelling and machine learning and that sort of thing, but might be a stretch goal. But any movement to reduce the cost of sampling soil carbon would be beneficial. So what sort of movement or what sort of gains in soil carbon could you have realistically? Well, that's the big question. It really depends on where you're starting off with, what the intervention is, what the practice change you make, as well as the climate type, which I'll detail shortly. It can range from between nothing to 0.8 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year, which is between $0 and $24 a hectare per year. But if you talk to different people, the returns vary quite widely, so it can be a big loss, 250,000 to gains of up to 2 million, depending on who you talk to. So my team has worked on carbon farming with farmers, industry, government and academia for probably 20 years, particularly systems modelling and satellite imagery and that sort of thing. And one thing that we've shown time and time again, for a carbon price for about $20 a tonne, and that's a bit more than that now, productivity benefits. So if you improve soil organic matter, not soil organic carbon, the returns that you get about 10 times as much as the current income from carbon. So what that is a productivity co-benefit, and I'll talk a bit about that later. But one example is a study we did with the University of Melbourne. If you improve soil organic matter, the additional nitrogen mineralisation from humus was between $126 to $200 per hectare per year, whereas you're getting about $24 a hectare per year for the income from the carbon. And that's detailed in scientific publications. So there were 7 real main messages that I wanted to talk about today. The first one is that soil carbon markets tend to focus on permanence, but short-term carbon is the actual form of carbon that offers the greatest fertility benefits for pasture or fodder growth. So the 3 main fractions, and really there's a whole continuum of fractions, but soil scientists tend to divide them into 3. The first one there on the left-hand side is particulate organic carbon, and that's quick. So that's things like fresh residues and living organisms, and that doesn't last in the soil for long. But that's the one that benefits plant growth. Humus also benefits plant growth and lasts in the soil for up to 40 years. And then you have a resistant one, or recalcitrant organic carbon, and that's a little bit like charcoal, and that lasts in the soil for a long time, but that can only really be derived from things like fire-derived forms and looks a bit like charcoal. So carbon markets tend to focus on permanence. So the Australian government, and there are other carbon markets, but if we talk about the Australian government one, or emissions reduction fund methodology, the contract period is between 25 minimum and 100 years. So you have to improve soil carbon and maintain it permanently, in apostrophes, out of the atmosphere for at least 25 years. But particulate organic matter and humus actually have greater value in terms of fertility, but they degrade a lot quicker. So if you're thinking about permanence, in the short term, your interventions mainly improve particulate organic carbon, but that's easily lost because it's quickly cycling. The bugs break it down and it degrades to CO2. So if you want your soil carbon to be permanent, you make a practice change. You build up your particulate organic carbon and your humus, the two fractions that you can change, but you have to keep that built up, noting that it's continually degrading and lost. So what does a high soil carbon actually look like? So you can usually tell by the colour. So it's darker soils, and particularly vertisols and journisms have very high soil carbon. In Australia, most soil organic carbon levels are low, so they might be between 0.5% and 4%. 4 or 5% would be quite high. This soil is about 7 or 8%, which is exceptionally high. A sandy soil or a calcareous or a soil in a low rainfall environment might have about 0.5% soil organic carbon. And really that's determined by your climate type, it's determined by seasonal ground cover, and to a lesser extent management. The second main thing that I wanted to say was that practices that improve soil organic matter, not soil organic carbon, are to be encouraged. Because there's a lot of benefits to improving soil organic matter, regardless of whether or not you're in a soil carbon market. So a 1% gain in soil organic carbon represents about 133 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per hectare. So the whole reason the government and others incentivise people to build up soil organic carbon is because it's very sensitive to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the more gains in soil organic carbon we have, the less CO2 in the atmosphere and the less global warming. But it also has drought resilience. So a 1% gain in soil organic carbon represents about 144,000 litres of water. So it actually holds on to water and provides drought resilience. And it has a whole bunch of chemical, physical and biological benefits as well. But as I said before, the productivity gains associated with soil carbon, associated with soil organic matter, are often worth more than the income from soil carbon per se, from enrolling in a carbon market. But if you improve soil organic matter, you generally have a productivity co-benefit. So what practices can you actually change to improve soil organic matter? It really depends on where you are and what your production system is and what your prevailing climate is. So the practices that you might have at your disposal in a rangeland environment are very different to what they might be in an intensive high rainfall zone. Things like retaining crop stubble and not burning. Burning is a direct way to lose soil organic carbon and CO2 into the atmosphere. Anything that maintains ground cover, and so that will be context specific, but you could think about reducing stocking rates when you've had a particularly long dry spell. Anything you can do to reduce surface erosion, whether it's wind or water. Improve pasture species diversity so that you've got different phenologies and different development stages, and they're ripening and maturing and flowering at different times of the year, so you're maintaining ground cover. Converting from annual crops to perennials, so therefore you're really reducing cultivation. The more you cultivate, the more you rip up organic matter and the more you lose soil carbon. In the north, you've got savanna burning methodologies, and there's another emissions reduction fund method for the savanna burning method. And that's really to burn earlier in the dry season when fires are cooler and more patchy, as opposed to burning later in the dry season when it's hotter and drier. You've got things like inter-row crops, That's for horticulture, for tree crops and vines. Then there's things like organic amendments. Western Australia has played around a bit with clay delving, and the idea there is if you've got a non-wetting sand, you invert it, and you put that clay up into the surface and mix that clay into the non-wetting sand, and therefore things grow more. Encourage people to do a little bit of testing with that before they actually do it, and Stephen Hobbs, who's on the line, has had some experience with non-wetting sands, I think. Things like new irrigation. If you've got a rain-fed paddock and you're starting off new irrigation there and it's going to be maintained, well, that will build up soil carbon. So that's an opportunity as well. We've done an experiment and it's just come to the end, and that was funded by MLA. That was feeding biochar cattle as a free choice ad libitum. We mixed a bit of salt with it at the start so they got the taste of it. Biochar's undegradable, so it goes through the animal, comes out in the manure. The dung beetles get into the manure and carry that biochar into the soil, and you can see their black tunnels into the soil. The idea is that biochar also reduces enteric methane, so that's methane from fermentation coming out their mouth, and improves live weight gain. Now, we didn't see any difference in live weight gain associated with the biochar group compared with the control. So, you know, it really depends on the type of biochar and the animals and the type of year. So their consumption varied depending on the time of year. But really the point there is that these are mobile spreaders of organic carbon because it's undegradable and they spread it out in their manure. Another point that I'd make is that to build soil organic carbon, we really need to build up soil organic matter. And the reason for that is because soil carbon is not built up as an individual element, as in C. It's built up as a bundle, and that bundle is carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and that's what soil organic matter really is. So I worked a lot with Clive Kirkby at CSIRO, and he actually did his PhD on soil carbon, and he said really to build up soil carbon we need to add all the other nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur. So 1 tonne of soil organic carbon as humus locks up 80 kilos of N plus 20 kilos of phosphorus plus 14 kilos of sulfur. And if you don't add those nutrients, organic material simply decays to carbon dioxide. The bugs eat it and they respire, and you lose the carbon dioxide out of the soil. It's worth noting at this point that all soils are constantly respiring and losing CO2. So to build up carbon, you want more carbon going into the soil relative to what's going out, and there is always CO2 coming out. To build up soil carbon, we really need to build up soil organic matter, and to build up soil organic matter, we need to add other nutrients. And so if you think about carbon to nitrogen ratios of various substrates, the fertile ones, or the ones that enable plant growth, are things with a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, like poultry manure or humus or cow manure, up to 17:1. Things like sawdust and newspaper, you would intuitively think, well, that's not going to do much for growth. And that's because they've got high carbon to nitrogen ratios, and you put it on the soil and the bugs gobble up all the nitrogen and don't allow any for the plants because the carbon to nitrogen ratio is so high. The third message I'd make is that carbon markets attempt to decouple effects of climate from background effects in management. Sorry, that's the wrong way around. They attempt to decouple the effects of management from background effects of climate, which you can't change. So if you think about a long-term rainfall map for Australia, this is over 100 years, you've got the lowest in the centre, between 50 and 100 millimetres a year, around Oodnadatta. You've got the highest rainfall around near the edges, particularly Cairns, up to 1.8 to 2.4 metres, and Western Tasmania. If you look at soil organic carbon at the continental scale, it's lowest in the centre, where that sort of dark orange zone is, 5 tonnes of carbon per hectare, and it's highest near the edges. And if I flick backwards and forwards, you can see that, well, there's a pretty close correlation between where rainfall is high and high soil carbon, and where rainfall is low, you get low soil carbon. So then if you were somewhere in Australia and you were intending to build up soil organic carbon, you might look, well, where I am in the landscape, is there a prospect of raising soil carbon, or am I generally in a low carbon landscape? And if you are, well, then your ability to maintain soil carbon, build up soil carbon for a longer time might be somewhat less than someone who was near the coast in a degraded soil in a high rainfall zone. The fourth point that I'd make is that soil carbon is ephemeral. So it comes and it goes. So this soil carbon here was about 0.5%. 9 months later, simply with the La Nina, it had gone up to about 1% with no management change, simply due to rainfall. The fifth message is that for soil carbon permanence, your practice change must be permanent. So you can't make a practice change for 2 years and then decide, well, I'll go and do annual crops and canola now and rip it up, and then your soil carbon is gone again. So if you think about a typical soil carbon, it might have 1.2% carbon at the start. They typically have an upper bound beyond which you can't really increase anymore. So soil carbon will increase to a point and then you're at the maximum. You can't really increase it above that point. It can go to a lower bound called a lower equilibrium, but typical paddocks will be oscillating anywhere in between. With the drought, soil carbon will go down. With the La Nina or wet year, it'll go up, it'll go down, it'll go up, so on. If you consistently add nutrients or you cut out cultivation and you consistently change your practices, well, then soil carbon would go up if you started from a lower base. On the other hand, you could make it go up for a little bit and then you might say, well, just let it go, or you stop managing it for whatever reason, and soil carbon would go down again. So to maintain growth in soil carbon, you have to maintain that practice change. If you start off near the top, if you're starting off from a high soil carbon and then you enroll in the soil carbon market, well, then your prospects of gaining soil carbon are probably quite low because you're up near that upper bound. On the other hand, if you start near the bottom from a degraded soil, well, then your scope for improving soil carbon is probably quite high. A farmer in Alice Springs said to me that soil carbon markets make the good farmers bad and the bad farmers good. And what she meant by that is, well, if I've built my soil up over the last 50 years and I'm relatively high soil organic carbon now, well, then I probably haven't got much scope for improving it if I enroll in the carbon market. Whereas if I've degraded it, well, I've probably got huge scope for improving it. The sixth point is that soil carbon markets are for a long time, 25 to 100 years. The climate is changing and the climate will change in that period. Rainfall is very sporadic and it will change in different ways in different regions, seasonally and regionally dependent. Temperature, it's almost certain that temperature will go up. So we've shown that as temperature goes up, soil temperature increases, soil respiration increases, and so the rate at which soil carbon sequestration, so that's the rate of change of soil carbon over time, will slow down, and that's because soils are warmer. So soil carbon sequestrations out to 2050 went down by between 55 and 133%, simply because soil respiration increased and you lost more soil carbon than you were gaining under historical climates. And the seventh point, and this is my final point, is that there's somewhat divergent aspirations between what governments want and what an individual wants. An individual, and we've worked a lot with farmers and industries, typically interested in prosperity, intergenerational sustainability, to a lesser extent productivity. The government is interested primarily in mitigation of global climate change for public good. So that comes down to the contentious issue of additionality, and my team has a lot of complaints about additionality. Additionality is a policy instrument part of the soil carbon ERF, and that's additionality means the rate of change of soil organic carbon relative to some arbitrary baseline is more than what it would have been in the absence of a practice change or a management intervention. And this comes back to the point I made about the Alice Springs farmer before. If you've degraded your soil and it's been bare for most of the time, well, then you've got huge scope to gain. You've got huge scope for additionality. Whereas if your soil carbon is up near the top, 4 or 5 or 6%, well, then your scope for additionality and therefore gains under a soil carbon market are probably quite low. So one way to rethink about soil carbon markets, and I work a lot with the government, and the big wheels of government turn rather slowly, but they do listen. So one way to think about it might be to pay people based on carbon stocks rather than the flux. So a flux is a change in two carbon stocks over time. A carbon stock is what's there now. It's easier to measure, there's less variability. So it's kind of like a payment for environmental stewardship rather than a change in soil carbon between 2 points. So you might say, well, you just showed me a map that soil carbon varies quite widely across Australia, and that's exactly right. So you might pay people based on regional thresholds. So you might say, well, if it was above some arbitrary threshold, say 75%, you get paid. Whereas if you fall below that, you don't get paid. And so that would incentivize people to say, well, look, I'm 70% of the way there. I've got to raise it up another 5%, and therefore I get paid and I maintain those payments. The payments might be different, but that would incentivize people to hold that carbon in the soil, and it would actually pay people for historical good management practice prior to enrolling in a carbon market. So I think payments for stocks would be more effective than payments for fluxes. So my final point is that coming back to the title, are soil carbon markets really science or snake oil? Practices, regardless of whether or not you're in a carbon market, practices that build up organic matter are to be encouraged because they're generally beneficial. At the continental scale, soil organic carbon stocks tend to follow long-term rainfall. Soil carbon is easily gained, but it's also easily lost. The financial returns of soil carbon markets vary widely. Carbon credits that are sold can no longer be claimed in your farm greenhouse gas emissions baseline. So the prices of carbon credits are going up in future. If you wanted to market a carbon neutral product, carbon neutral beef or carbon neutral milk, carbon neutral wool, if you've sold those credits to the government or someone else, you can no longer claim them as part of your farm business. Unless you sequester more and you don't sell them, once you've sold them and you've got money, you can't claim them as part of a carbon neutral product. Productivity benefits of soil organic matter outweigh market income from carbon markets. That's at $20 per ACCU, and carbon prices are going up. Some costs associated with acquiring ACCUs or carbon credits are tax deductible, but the proceeds are actually assessable income as well. You can't avoid the tax office. So whether or not carbon markets are science or snake oil really depends on the motivations of the individual. Some people have done it and they've got a lot of money out of it. Other people have held on to their credits due to risk. So it just depends on age, stage, production system and location, I think. So that's all I've got to say, and I'll hand over to you, Hayley.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you for the invitation to be involved. First of all, I'd like to say that Matt had some really great points there, and something that I guess I'd like to draw your attention to is when you're looking at starting a soil carbon project, is to know what your motivation is. And I think that's really the thing that underpins what you will do. And whether that motivation is, you want to have access to markets, future markets, or offsets, or to increase your landscape function, they'll have quite a significant bearing on what project that you run and how you will do it. Other things that Matt mentioned there, the price of the carbon, that has quite a significant impact on what you're able to do as well too in the landscape too, and then how you're going to go about it. Whether you have got a large enough project to run on your own, or whether you need to use an aggregator. I'm into my sixth year now, 7th year. Yeah, coming up 7. Sorry, and we didn't actually have a big enough project to do it on our own, because we needed, at that time, you needed to have equivalent to 2,000 tonnes of carbon, and so I combined with some other farmers, because we didn't know how to draw down carbon either. So we're all in different rainfall zones, so we decided to all do our own thing and then compare and see who can build carbon the most successfully, organic carbon. So, and it's been an interesting exercise talking with some of the other guys to see how they've got on too with their carbon projects as well. Permanence was something that Matt mentioned, and that also interestingly has a bit of an impact on your financier. Actually, if you're going to have an obligation on your land for 20 years or 25 years, they have a different consideration about how they treat your security. And as Matt mentioned too, the site selection is really important, because the lower the organic carbon in your soil, the more potential you have to build it. And as I mentioned, the big thing was how do we go about building carbon. So this has all been suck it and see. So hopefully you can pick up something from it. I'm not an expert by any means, but I'm getting a bit of a feel for how it behaves in our landscape. So where I wanted to start with was just to give you a bit of an idea, a feeling of why, what one of my motivators was to change. And this is our annual rainfall in our local area. And you can see that it varies quite considerably. And these recordings haven't all been, observations haven't all been recorded on the farm. We're not that far from Conniva, about 12 kilometres across the paddock. And so I've used Conniva's rainfall observations because unfortunately Grandpa and Dad never used to write the rainfall records down. But I could see and anecdotally felt that there was a decline in rainfall in our environment. And I wanted to put together a bit of a data set just to see if there was a trend there. And so in 1980, I was given a notepad from Mum, and she said, "This is your job to write down the rainfall." And so I've managed to keep the rainfall since then. And it's interesting putting our observations in there, actual observations on the farm. And when you talk to the old fellas about the droughts, historical droughts, they're all sitting between this 200 and 300 mil rainfall band here. And so our frequency of drought traditionally has been about 1 year in 10. And since I started farming, most of my rainfalls have been all down here. The last few years we've had some higher totals, but only twice since the late 80s have we actually had rainfall that exceeded our long-term average. And that's just really summarising. That's where we are at the moment. We've had around about a 18% decline in our annual rainfall. Most of it has actually come out of our growing season. Another thing that we've observed is the increased frost. So from first to last frost, it used to be well under 100 days, but now our frost average frost season is now 147 days from first frost to last, which puts our latest frosts right in the middle of flowering. So, and that has been a real bugger for me, to be honest. I've been getting frosted 8 years out of 10, various levels of damage. The other thing that we noticed too is that getting higher temperatures too. We're still recording temperatures of at least 30 degrees in April. So considering these things, the changes in the environment, we went through a review of the farm, and we looked at what our risks and opportunities were, and so it became really apparent to me that it was the livestock enterprise that was really carrying the weight of the farming operation. And ironically, we were trying to crop, but it was becoming more risky. And the downside, I guess, of cropping is that we were starting to produce chemical-resistant weeds. And as mentioned before, frost was starting to become an issue for us as well. And so there are a whole lot of things that I identified here that, why not eat the weeds so we can get rid of our chemical resistance problem that way. Sheep may not certainly have the turnover, but they certainly have a lower risk profile. And then we start to looking at our grazing systems, focusing on the perennial grasses. As Matt mentioned before, they're a really key thing. We can maintain that ground cover. There's a lot of benefits of it. So you can see here a lot of the benefits and opportunity that I saw actually all fitted under this this point here of looking at carbon, soil organic carbon. So that was, all these other things were actually the driver for me to actually consider and start the soil organic, an emissions reduction fund soil carbon project. The other thing too that was a bit of an unknown was how much it was all going to cost. And so I set about wanting to try and do the stuff that was easiest and the lowest cost. And so we really had no idea how to go about it. We've seen people like Cole Sice, for example, with what he'd done there with his cover crops up in Nona, and people like Graham Hand were talking about recovery, high intensity grazing and long recoveries. And so we thought we'd set up a safe to fail trial area and see what the impacts were of high density grazing and long recovery times. And this just gives you a bit of an idea of then how your country responds under your conditions. So it gives you a bit of an idea with your management, and it's a really important tool in helping you to understand your landscape and management. So then how does this all translate? Also then, this is an aerial view of our farm, and you can see up here there's some quite light sandy stuff, and we're actually on the edge of what used to be known as the Big Desert Wilderness. Our farm was part of the Yarrick Station, and that was a 50,000 acre selection, which basically bordered the scrub. And in the late 50s, 60s, AMP developed a lot of the country and opened it up. So we have some very light soils. And so you can see here that we set up 2 carbon estimation areas, carbon estimation area 1 down here, and carbon estimation area 2. So they were actually 2 patches of the farm that are very light and sandy, very low organic carbon levels. And historically, they'd only been grazed for short periods of time with set stocking, and we'd have to pull the livestock out to avoid erosion. And to screw a lot of annual weeds too, cape weeds, silvergrass, brome grass, all those useless weeds that really didn't provide much benefit at all. So we thought they would be the obvious areas to try to see whether we could get some response. And so then we set about initiating these 2 projects. As Matt alluded to, in your estimation area, you need to sample, and so each area was broken down into three areas, and then samples taken, and that set a baseline, and then it was up to us to implement our management changes. So for me, this is what we did. So with the carbon estimation area number 1, we wanted to see what the function and purpose and role of perennial plants would be, and how they would change the landscape, and how much soil organic carbon could they possibly build. And so we already had some established lucerne and a bit of cocksfoot and phalaris, and then other areas we tried to try and regenerate perennials and get them to come back in the landscape, and that would involve high impact stocking and grazing, and then a 12-month recovery time. And then carbon estimation area 2, I wanted to compare it by using a mixture of cover crops, and we looked at basically just using a variety of commonly available crops, because we have a winter gap feed issue here. In the winter time, it gets cold and wet, not much grows, and so what I thought was the most sensible was to use things that do grow in the winter time. So that's traditional winter crops. So my cover crop consists of things like barley, oats, cereal rye, peas, vetch, and then we want some flowering plants in there, so I'll put a bit of mustard in there and some tillage radish and turnips. And it was a fairly low cost, because most of that I had on hand. The interesting thing was that the amount of bulk that have been able to grow with that material has been quite amazing. And it's allowed us to now run all our ewes as one mob. And this last year we had 7. So this is a 100-acre paddock, and we had 700 ewes in there, and we're just shifting the fencing, portable electric fencing every 2 days, and we only managed to get halfway around the paddock before we needed to stop to join our ewes. But it's absolutely amazing to see the changes happening in the landscape. And I've also set up some Wi-Fi cameras, so I don't have to go down to monitor the animals frequently. I can just check them at any time from my phone to see how they're going. And I've been really quite surprised by how well both blocks have actually responded. But the idea now is, now that we've got some ground cover and some decent cover over the carbon estimation area 2, we're now just going to try and use grazing to see what perennials we can get to come back in the landscape. So, and it was great last year because we actually came back and did the retests on there to try and see how whether we'd built any soil organic carbon and how responsive each of those 2 blocks had been. And so we had tested down to 1 metre, and so you can see in that little chart there that we have carbon estimation area 1 and 2, and it's broken into the 2 measurements for each core that needed to be taken from each site. And it was interesting to see that where the perennials were, we had around about a 33% increase in that top 30 centimetres, and over 100% in the bottom 70 centimetres. And in carbon estimation area 2, using the cover crops, there was a 44% increase approximately, and 131 in the lower profile. So it was, and down the bottom here you can just see a core. Now, unfortunately, that one was taken right in the gateway. The plots are randomly, the sites are randomly selected by the program, and that was about the only piece of decent heavy dirt in the whole paddock. It's right inside the gateway. The rest of it's all light. But these cores were taken randomly over, so there's actually nine cores. So it gives you a fairly good representation of the whole paddock. But I'd just like to really reinforce and back up with Matt's comment about the productivity gains, and it has really been amazing just to see how these blocks have responded to the high impact, long recovery management. And I think that's really been the thing that has been missing in historical management, in that we've overgrazed them. We think that set stocking, it's convenient and it works out well, but actually by going to using temporary electric fencing, it enabled me to move the land, stock over the landscape more thoroughly and get a higher brush utilisation. It's given us that impact, and it's it's been quite a remarkable turnaround. I really can't believe it. I've been very surprised just how it's all gone. So these initial results are really encouraging, and I'm starting to now select other parts of the farm and starting to put in some electric fencing to try and repeat the same results over other parts of the farm that are lower lying and frost susceptible. So we're now looking at transferring the cropping part of the enterprise to the highest ground, which is not necessarily the best for cropping, but it's out of the frost zone. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm quite happy to answer any questions, but I hope that's given you a bit of an overview.
Thank you, Greg, and apologies for that hiccup. And thanks firstly to Matt and Steve for their presentations. Matt gave an excellent overview, and I congratulate Steve on being able to negotiate the jungle of this 2021, well, the soil carbon methods. I've been asked to talk to you about the requirements for the Emissions Reduction Fund 2021 soil carbon method and to look at some of the considerations if you are thinking of participating in the method. Like many methods in the ERF, the soil carbon method is highly detailed. It contains a lot of legal, administrative and technical detail. And that's all intended to make it more accurate and to ensure that the ACCUs have integrity and market value. But while it'd be easier, if things were simpler, the complexity of agriculture itself and the complexity of the carbon market method do need to contain enough detail to make the system have credibility. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to point to some of the questions that you may wish to consider. And there isn't a lot of time, so I can't go into all the detail, but I'll have to cover this fairly quickly, but I hope it points you to the direction of the sort of questions that you may like to ask. Currently, there are two ERF methods, a model method from 2015 that uses default values, and a measure model method from 2021. The default method value has no projects registered under it, so I'm only going to talk to you about the 2021 method, which includes two options for assessing, for quantifying carbon credits, and it builds on a 2014 and a 2018 method. The interest in soil carbon methods has grown enormously over the last couple of years. And if you look at this figure here, it just shows how new project registrations have grown. So from 2015 to 2019, there were only 43 projects registered. We're now up to something like 450 projects registered. And in fact, soil carbon is the fastest growing method of all the ERF methods, and it's growing at a greater rate than anything else, any other method. So, there is a need to understand though what it means to participate in a method. And Hayley mentioned earlier that only one project has actually received ACCUs yet, and there are a number of reasons for that. The necessary delay between registration and between reporting. Steve mentioned that after 5 years, he had very good results. And it takes a period of that length of time to be able to detect a change reliably in many cases. And there have also been a number of other hiccups that we could talk about later if anyone's interested in question time. But what does it mean to participate in a project, to start off a project? This figure is adapted from the Clean Energy Regulator, the government body that controls the Emissions Reduction Fund crediting. And I've divided here into 5 stages. The middle 3 stages are actually about how, from registration until receiving ACCUs, are about the running of the project. And the details for those are set out in great detail in the information that is on the website from the regulator. So I'm going to talk more about the first stage and the final stage, which is where decisions are made by the producer, by someone who's participating. So just very briefly, the project stages from registration to receiving ACCUs, stages 2, 3, and 4, do require a lot of work. They're very detailed, but there's little option. You must comply with the rules and the requirements that are set out by the legislation. So I'm not going to talk about them in detail, and this is just in the interest of time. I'll talk about the first stage, which is the planning and decision stage. And Stephen talked about how he considered and his colleagues considered participating. And it can be very location specific and very specific to the values and the conditions that each producer experiences. It's important to understand the scheme, though, and the method eligibility requirements and the legal obligations. You have to have the consent of all eligible interest holders. So these may be co-owners of the land. They may be the bank with whom you hold a mortgage, maybe the Indigenous land rights holders. And you have to make sure all that eligibility is in place first. Are there any regulatory approvals that apply? These may be state government rather than federal government. They may be even local government about what you're allowed to do on that land in terms of the way you manage it. And you have to, the project proponent has to satisfy the fit and proper person assessments. This is a legal requirement. And, you know, the normal things like police checks come under there. It's important also to understand the requirements of the ERF particular scheme and the methods that must be met. The land eligibility requirement must be met for the duration of the project. For example, the land must not have been cleared in the 7 years prior to registration, and the land has to have been managed for either grazing or cropping, or under the new method for forestry under some conditions. And then you have to understand what eligible management activities fit within the land and the business goals that you have on your property. So there's a list of 13 eligible activities, and at least one of those has to be maintained for the period of the project, which is 25 or 100 years, as Matt explained earlier. And then there's a whole lot of questions that you have to ask with respect to your particular production system. So the project has to be practical and has to fit within the way you're managing your farm to make a living and your business goals. So you'd have to carefully understand and map the project area. You have to realistically consider what management strategy you can maintain. You have to understand the economic and management aspects of the project, the benefits and the trade-offs in terms of resources as well as dollars. You have to see whether it's actually worth your while to participate in an ERF project, the expected project returns and the costs and the risks that you may not be able to successfully build soil carbon or to maintain it because of climate change, because of climate variability between droughts and floods, etc. These are all things that you need to be thinking about before you decide whether to enter into the minefield of carbon farming projects. And you ask, what's the best business model for the project? Do you have to, who the project proponent should be, what time and time allocation and skills are required? And if you make a decision to participate in an ERF soil organic carbon project, do you need to engage a carbon service provider? As Stephen discussed, you know, an aggregator may be the best way to go, but you have to ensure that you understand the fees and the responsibilities before entering into a contract. So this is all a process of thinking and understanding that should be gone through before you even sign up to a project. And so that will take you to stage one. Now, assuming you do decide to have a soil organic carbon project under the ERF, you will eventually, hopefully, receive ACCUs. And I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes in talking about what you do with these ACCUs, because whether you enter into a project depends on what you might want to do with the ACCUs at the end. And if you don't understand that, perhaps it's not for you anyway. You can hold the ACCUs for later use. You don't have to sell them to make income or do anything else with them unless you have an obligation under a contract with a carbon service provider, or you need the money immediately to offset some of the costs of taking part in the project. You can sell the ACCUs either to the government or in a private commercial contract, or you can decide to retire the ACCUs to offset on-farm emissions to claim carbon neutrality. And that's an important consideration likely to be needed in the future. So all of those decisions are things that you have to bear in mind before participating. And I'd just like to finish with one slide that just reminds everyone that these projects are a long-term commitment for at least 25 years, and there are substantial obligations attached to them. The 2021 method does provide some landholders with the opportunity to earn ACCUs and income for every tonne of carbon sequestered, but it isn't for everyone. And just to summarise the considerations that are recommended before committing to an ERF contract or other carbon credit scheme, you seek out information from trusted sources, and the information has to be applicable to your location and production system. What works in a fertile, temperate environment in southern Australia is not going necessarily to be applicable in extensive semi-arid rangelands in the north of the country. You have to make sure that you understand the uncertainties, the risks, and the potential non-carbon impacts. And you have to evaluate realistic estimates of project costs, benefits, trade-offs against personal and business goals. And I think these 3 points are really critical considerations before entering into contracts. But having said all that, maintaining and where possible increasing soil organic matter is good for soil health and productivity. And both Matt and Stephen made that point, that the production benefits can outweigh the carbon credit benefits. But you may increase long-term soil organic carbon storage, and that can be a great benefit in some cases. But it's important to understand the individual circumstances. So with that, I'll finish and hand back to Greg. Thank you.